Story 1. The Missing Children of the Swiss Alps. I need to tell you about something that happened during World War II that still haunts me to this day. I was part of a British reinforcement unit sent to Switzerland in 1943. At the time, I was just 19 years old, barely out of training, and this was my first real deployment. Switzerland was trying to maintain its neutrality, but tensions were rising with Germany, and our government decided to send support to help defend key mountain passes. Our company was stationed in a remote village called Bergdorf, high up in the Swiss Alps. The place was like something out of a fairy tale: wooden chalets with steep roofs, snow-covered peaks surrounding us on all sides, and maybe 200 villagers who had lived there for generations. Most of them spoke German, which made communication difficult, since only our sergeant knew a few phrases. The village was so isolated that supply runs only came once a month, weather permitting. During winter, we were completely cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. The locals were friendly enough, though they kept to themselves mostly. They'd nod politely when they saw us on patrol, and the children would sometimes wave from their windows. Everything seemed peaceful for the first few weeks. We settled into a routine: morning drills, afternoon patrols, evening reports. The biggest excitement was when Private Henderson slipped on some ice and twisted his ankle. That's how quiet it was. Then, things started going wrong. It began with small items disappearing from around the village: a tarp from someone's woodshed, some planks of wood that had been stacked behind the blacksmith's shop, tools that villagers swore they'd left out the night before. At first, nobody thought much of it. Things go missing in small communities all the time. But then, Sergeant Mills called us together for a briefing. He looked troubled, which was unusual for him. Mills was a veteran of the North Africa campaign, not easily shaken. "Men," he said, "the village elder came to see me this morning. He's concerned about some thefts that have been happening. Now, I know none of you would take anything from these people, but I want to make sure we're all keeping our eyes open." We assured him we hadn't seen anything suspicious. The village seemed as peaceful as ever during our patrols. 2 days later, everything changed. I was on evening patrol with Private Reginald when we heard shouting from the village square. An older man was gesturing frantically, speaking rapid German. The few English words we could make out were child and missing. We managed to find Frau Weber, the school teacher, who spoke broken English. She explained that little Klaas Hoffman, a 6-year-old boy, had vanished from his family's home sometime during the night. His parents had put him to bed as usual, but when they went to wake him in the morning, his bed was empty. The window was open despite the freezing temperature. The entire village turned out to search for Klaus. We joined the effort, combing through the surrounding forest and checking every building. But there was no trace of him. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Sergeant Mills organized additional patrols and told us to be extra vigilant. "Could be wolves," he said, though none of us had seen any signs of large predators in the area. The local hunters insisted there hadn't been wolves in these mountains for decades. 3 days passed. Then another child disappeared. This time it was Anna Mueller, an 8-year-old girl. Same pattern: put to bed by her parents, gone by morning, window open. The villagers were starting to panic. Parents began barricading their children's rooms at night, but somehow it didn't matter. Within a week, 2 more children had vanished. The village was gripped by terror. Mothers refused to let their children out of sight, and fathers started taking turns staying awake all night with rifles, watching the streets. That's when Private Reginald volunteered for extra night duty. Reginald was a quiet fellow from Yorkshire, maybe 20 years old. He'd always been good with children. I'd seen him playing with the village kids during our off hours, teaching them English words and sharing his chocolate rations. He was genuinely upset about the disappearances and wanted to help catch whoever was responsible. "I'll take the midnight to dawn shift," he told Sergeant Mills. I know these streets better than anyone now, and I'm a light sleeper anyway." Mills approved the request. Reginald started patrolling alone through the early morning hours, walking the same routes we'd established, but paying extra attention to the residential areas where the children had disappeared. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The village remained quiet, and no more children went missing. We started to think maybe Reginald's presence was deterring whatever predator had been taking them. Then Reginald himself disappeared. I was the one who found his empty bunk the next morning. His rifle was gone, but his pack and personal belongings were still there. No sign of a struggle in the barracks. It was like he'd simply walked out into the night and never returned. Sergeant Mills was furious and worried in equal measure. "A grown man doesn't just vanish," he kept saying, "not a trained soldier." We organized search parties immediately. The entire company spent 2 days combing every inch of the surrounding area. We found his rifle about half a mile from the village, just lying in the snow, but there was no other trace of him. The villagers were convinced now that some kind of monster was stalking their community. They spoke in hushed tones about demons and evil spirits that lived in the mountain caves. The local priest held special prayer services, and people started hanging crosses and garlic in their windows. But Sergeant Mills wasn't buying the supernatural explanations. "There's a logical explanation for this," he insisted. "We're dealing with a person, not a monster." He increased our patrols and instituted a buddy system. No one went anywhere alone ever. We started doing hourly check-ins via radio. The village felt like it was under siege. Then, one night about a week after Reginald's disappearance, we got our break. I was paired with Private Morrison for the midnight patrol. We were walking through the residential district when Morrison grabbed my arm and pointed toward one of the houses. "There," he whispered, "at the window." I looked where he was pointing and saw a dark figure standing outside the Schneider family's house, peering through the ground floor window. The figure was human-shaped, but something about its posture seemed wrong, unnatural. "Hey," Morrison shouted, "stop right there." The figure turned toward us, and even in the darkness, I could see that something was terribly wrong. Then it ran. We gave chase, following the figure as it bounded through the snow with impossible speed and agility. It led us to the edge of the village, toward a steep slope that dropped down into a narrow ravine. That's where it seemed to disappear into the ground. "Where did it go?" Morrison panted, scanning the area with his flashlight. I was examining the slope when I noticed something. What looked like a hole in the snow, partially hidden by overhanging rocks. It was big enough for a person to crawl through. "Here," I called, "there's some kind of cave or tunnel." We called for backup on the radio, and within minutes, Sergeant Mills arrived with 4 more men. He ordered us to surround the entrance while he tried to make contact with whoever was inside. "This is Sergeant Mills of His Majesty's Army," he called into the darkness. "Come out with your hands visible. We want to talk." The response was a sound I'll never forget, a low animalistic growling that definitely came from a human throat. "Reginald?" Mills called. "Is that you, lad?" More growling, followed by what sounded like someone moving around in the confined space. Mills made the decision to go in. "Cover me," he told us. "If something happens, you seal this entrance and wait for reinforcements." He crawled into the hole with his flashlight and pistol. For several minutes, we heard nothing but scraping sounds and muffled voices. Then suddenly, there was shouting and the sound of a struggle. "Get back," Mills yelled from inside. "Jesus Christ, get back." Then we heard gunshots, 3 of them in rapid succession. After what felt like an eternity, Mills emerged from the cave, his face pale and his hands shaking. "What happened?" Morrison asked. Mills just stared at us for a long moment before answering. "It was Reginald," he said quietly, "but not the way we knew him." He explained what he'd found in the cave. Reginald had been living there for over a week, but he was barely recognizable. His clothes were torn and filthy, his hair had grown wild, and his fingernails were long and caked with dirt and blood. But worst of all were his eyes, completely vacant, like looking at an animal. The cave itself was a horror show. Mills found the remains of 7 children arranged in a rough circle. Some had been partially eaten, others appeared to have been killed recently. The stench was overwhelming. When Mills tried to approach, Reginald had attacked him like a wild animal, clawing and biting. Mills had no choice but to shoot him. The cold, the isolation, the stress, it must have driven him mad, Mills said later when he filed his report. He snapped and became something else entirely. But I don't think that explained everything. The way that figure had moved when we chased it, the inhuman speed and agility, that wasn't just madness. And the look in Reginald's eyes in those final moments, according to Mills, wasn't the look of an insane person. It was the look of something that was no longer entirely human. We sealed the cave and told the villagers that we'd found and eliminated. What I'm about to tell you happened in the Pacific Theater in 1944, and for over 60 years, I never spoke about it to anyone. Not my wife, not my children, not even my therapist at the VA hospital. Some experiences are too horrible to share, too inhuman to put into words. But I'm old now, and these memories are eating me alive from the inside. Maybe if I tell someone, I can finally find some peace. I was a radio man with the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division during the Battle for Saipan. By July 1944, we'd been fighting the Japanese for weeks in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable. The heat was suffocating, the humidity made everything rot, and the enemy fought with a fanaticism that defied all logic. But this story isn't about the main battle. It's about what happened when my unit was separated from the main force during a Japanese counterattack and ended up lost in the jungle for 3 weeks. There were 8 of us initially: Lieutenant Harrison, Sergeant Burke, and 6 enlisted men, including myself. We'd been cut off during a particularly vicious firefight and found ourselves deep in the interior of the island with no idea how to get back to friendly lines. Our radio equipment had been damaged in the retreat, so we couldn't call for help. We had limited ammunition, almost no food, and the oppressive jungle seemed to close in around us more each day. Harrison decided our best bet was to head toward the coast and try to signal a passing ship or aircraft. For the first week, we managed okay. We found a small stream for water and supplemented our dwindling rations with tropical fruits and the occasional fish. The Japanese seemed to be concentrating their forces elsewhere, so we only had to avoid the occasional patrol. Then we stumbled upon the camp. We were following what looked like an old game trail when Burke suddenly held up his hand for us to stop. Through the thick vegetation ahead, we could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a clearing. "Could be natives," whispered Private Jackson. "Maybe they can help us." Harrison sent me and Private Coleman ahead to scout. We crept through the undergrowth until we reached the edge of the clearing. And what we saw there still haunts my nightmares. It was a Japanese military camp, but unlike any we'd encountered before. There were maybe 20 soldiers, but they moved with the slow, deliberate motions of men who were starving. Their uniforms hung loose on skeletal frames, and their faces had the hollow-eyed look of death. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the camp was a large fire pit with a crude spit constructed over it, and turning slowly on that spit was what was unmistakably a human torso. Coleman started to retch beside me, but I clamped my hand over his mouth before he could make any noise. We watched in horrified fascination as one of the Japanese soldiers approached the fire and used his bayonet to carve off a piece of the roasting meat. We'd heard rumors about Japanese cannibalism, but seeing it firsthand was different. These weren't desperate men making an impossible choice for survival. There was something ritualistic about their behavior, something that suggested this had become routine. We crept back to the others and reported what we'd seen. Harrison's face went white, but he maintained his composure. "We go around," he said simply. "Wide circle. We don't engage unless we have to." But fate had other plans. As we were skirting the edge of the clearing, Private Martinez stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed through the jungle like a gunshot, and suddenly the entire Japanese camp erupted into activity. They came at us through the trees like demons, screaming and wielding bayonets and improvised spears. But something was wrong with their attack. They moved too fast, with an unnatural coordination that seemed impossible for men in their emaciated condition. The firefight was brief but vicious. When the gun smoke cleared, we'd killed 6 of them, but we'd lost Martinez and Private Thompson. Harrison had taken a bayonet wound to his shoulder, and Burke was bleeding from multiple cuts. That's when we made our first terrible discovery. As we were checking the bodies of the dead Japanese soldiers, Coleman called out in a shaken voice, "Sir, you need to see this." One of the soldiers we'd killed was wearing dog tags around his neck. "American dog tags," Coleman read aloud. "Sir, this is one of ours." We checked the other bodies and found more American identification mixed with Japanese equipment. These weren't Japanese soldiers at all. They were American POWs who had somehow been changed. Harrison made the decision to investigate their camp. What we found there was beyond comprehension. The camp was littered with bones, human bones that had been cracked open to extract the marrow. Hanging from makeshift drying racks were strips of what could only be human flesh. And in a crude shelter at the far end of the clearing, we found them. 3 more American soldiers, alive but barely recognizable as human. They were chained to posts, their faces gaunt and their eyes wild with madness. When they saw us, they didn't call for help or show any sign of recognition. Instead, they snarled and lunged against their restraints like rabid animals. "Jesus Christ," Burke whispered. "What did they do to them?" We never found out the complete answer to that question, but we discovered enough to piece together the horror. In a makeshift shelter that served as their headquarters, we found a journal written in broken English by someone who might have been their commanding officer. The entries told a story of American prisoners who had been subjected to some kind of systematic psychological and physical torture designed to break down their humanity. They'd been forced to participate in ritualistic cannibalism, not just as victims but as willing participants. The process had taken months, but eventually they'd been transformed into something that was no longer recognizably human. The final entry in the journal, dated just 2 weeks before we arrived, was the most chilling. Transformation complete. They hunger only for flesh now. Soon we will have enough to create new hunting pack. The Americans will face their own kind, but their own kind will no longer be human. We found evidence that this particular group had been responsible for the disappearance of dozens of American servicemen over the past several months. They would capture isolated soldiers, bring them back to the camp, and begin the horrific process. Harrison ordered us to burn everything. The camp, the journal, the drying racks, all of it went up in flames. As for the 3 chained prisoners, we faced an impossible choice. They were clearly beyond help, no longer capable of rational thought or human communication. Harrison made the hardest decision of his military career. I won't describe what happened next, except to say that it was an act of mercy. We spent 2 more weeks in that jungle before finally making contact with friendly forces. During that time, we encountered evidence of other camps, other hunting packs of transformed prisoners roaming the dense interior of the island. We avoided them when possible and dealt with them when we couldn't. When we were finally rescued, we told our debriefing officers that we'd encountered Japanese forces engaged in cannibalistic practices against American prisoners. We mentioned nothing about the transformation process or the fact that some of the cannibals had once been American soldiers themselves. The official report classified the entire incident and buried it so deep that I doubt anyone still living has access to the files. The Army didn't want word getting out about what the Japanese had been doing to captured Americans, and they certainly didn't want anyone to know that those same Americans had been turned into monsters. But I know the truth. I lived through it, and I've carried the weight of it for over 60 years. War doesn't just kill men's bodies. Sometimes it destroys their very humanity, turning them into something that hunts their own kind. I've read about similar incidents in other theaters of the war, whispered accounts of prisoners who were subjected to unthinkable tortures and emerged as something no longer human. The military has always denied these stories, dismissed them as combat stress or wartime propaganda, but I was there. I saw what men can become when their humanity is systematically stripped away and replaced with something primal and hungry. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling through the trees outside my house, I still hear the sound of those chained men snarling and snapping at their restraints, no longer remembering that they had once been soldiers fighting for freedom and democracy. That's the real horror of war. Not just that good men die, but that sometimes they survive and become something worse than death. I've been reluctant to tell this story for over 70 years because I know how it sounds. Ghost planes, phantom squadrons, supernatural encounters during wartime. It's the stuff of pulp fiction and campfire stories. But I was there, and what I witnessed over the skies of Germany in 1945 was as real as anything else I experienced during the war. My name is Colonel William Bill, retired, and I flew P-51 Mustangs with the 352nd Fighter Group out of Bodney, England. By March 1945, we were conducting deep penetration missions into Germany, escorting bomber formations and engaging what remained of the Luftwaffe. This particular mission started like any other. We were escorting a formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses on a bombing run to Frankfurt. 24 bombers, 8 fighter escorts, beautiful clear weather with unlimited visibility, perfect flying conditions. I was Red Leader that day with Lieutenant Jimmy Kowalski as my wingman. Kid from Chicago, barely 21 years old, but one of the best natural pilots I'd ever seen. We'd flown together for 6 months and had developed the kind of partnership that kept you alive in air combat. The mission went smoothly for the first 2 hours. We crossed into German airspace without incident, and the bombers dropped their payloads on target with minimal opposition. A few scattered flak bursts, but nothing like the intense anti-aircraft fire we'd faced earlier in the war. It was on the return leg that things got strange. We were about 30 miles southwest of Frankfurt when my radio crackled to life. Red Leader, this is Blue 4. I've got bogeys at 2 o'clock high. Looks like a full squadron. I looked where Blue 4 indicated and saw them. 12 aircraft in perfect formation, heading directly toward our bombers. At that distance, I couldn't identify the aircraft type, but their approach vector suggested hostile intent. All red and blue flights, this is Red Leader. We have incoming bandits, 12 o'clock to the bomber formation. Let's go to work. We peeled off to intercept, climbing hard to gain altitude advantage. As we closed the distance, I could see the incoming aircraft more clearly through my dun sight, and that's when things started to feel wrong. The planes were definitely German. They had the distinctive twin-engine profile of Messerschmitt Bf-110s, but there was something odd about their appearance. Even at a distance, they looked faded somehow, like old photographs that had been left in the sun too long. Red Leader, this is Red 2. Kowalski's voice came through my headphones. Those planes look weird, sir. Something's not right about them. I was thinking the same thing, but we were committed to the intercept. The German formation showed no signs of deviating from their attack course, and they'd be in range of our bombers within minutes. Stay tight, Red 2, I replied. We'll sort it out after we splash them. But when we opened fire, that's when the real strangeness began. I had a perfect deflection shot on the lead German aircraft, and I poured a full burst into him from my 6.50 caliber machine guns. I saw my tracers connect with his fuselage and left engine, but there was no explosion, no smoke, no sign of damage at all. The plane continued flying as if nothing had happened. "What the hell?" Kowalski muttered over the radio. "I'm hitting them, but they're not going down." The German formation continued their attack run on the bombers, but their behavior was unlike any Luftwaffe pilots I'd encountered. They maintained perfect formation discipline, but they didn't seem to be actually firing at the bombers. They'd sweep in close, then pull away without engaging, only to come around for another pass. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As one of the German fighters passed close to my aircraft, I got a clear look at the cockpit. The canopy was intact, but I couldn't see a pilot inside. It was like the plane was flying itself. "Red Leader," came Blue 4's voice, tight with tension. "Sir, I just had one of those Kraut planes pass right through my wing. I mean through it, like it wasn't there." I thought Blue 4 was suffering from combat stress until I saw it happen myself. One of the German fighters executed a head-on pass against Red 3, and instead of breaking off at the last second, it flew directly through the American plane without any collision at all. Red 3's pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, came on the radio immediately. "Did you guys see that? That plane just went right through me. I felt my whole aircraft get cold, like someone opened a freezer door." The German formation made 3 more passes at our bombers, each time approaching as if to attack, but never actually firing. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they began to climb away toward the east. I made the decision to pursue. "Red Flight, follow me," I ordered. "We're going after them." We climbed hard, following the German formation as they headed deeper into German territory. They maintained their perfect formation, but they were climbing at an impossible rate, faster than any Bf-110 should have been capable of. As we chased them, I noticed other oddities. The German planes cast no shadows, despite the bright afternoon sun. When they passed through clouds, the vapor didn't disturb around their wings and fuselage like it should have. We followed them for about 10 minutes, pushing our engines to maximum power, but unable to close the distance. Then, as we approached what looked like a large military airfield, the German formation began to descend. "Red Leader, look at that airfield," Kowalski said. "Something's wrong with it." He was right. The airfield below us looked like it had been abandoned for years. The runways were cracked and overgrown with weeds. The hangars were bombed-out shells. But somehow, the German formation was lining up for landing approach as if the facility were fully operational. That's when I saw the other planes. Parked around the abandoned airfield were dozens of aircraft, German fighters and bombers in various states of decay. Some were missing wings, others were burned-out hulks. But mixed in among the German planes were Allied aircraft, American P-51s, British Spitfires, even some Russian fighters I didn't recognize. All of them looked like they'd been there for years, slowly rotting in the elements. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered over the radio. "Sir, that's a graveyard down there." The 12 Bf-110s touched down on the cracked runway as if it were perfectly maintained. They taxied to parking positions among the derelict aircraft and simply stopped. I made several low passes over the airfield, trying to understand what I was seeing. On my 3rd pass, I noticed movement among the parked aircraft. Figures in flight suits were emerging from cockpits and walking among the planes. At that altitude, I couldn't make out details, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too stiff, too coordinated, like they were marching rather than walking. "Red Leader, we need to get out of here," Kowalski said, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "This place feels wrong, really wrong." I was inclined to agree. My instruments had been acting strangely since we'd started following the German formation. My compass was spinning wildly, my altimeter was giving impossible readings, and my radio was picking up what sounded like German voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. But as we turned to leave, one more thing caught my eye. Painted on the side of one of the hangars, barely visible through years of weathering, was a designation, Geschwader der Verdammten, Squadron of the Damned. We made it back to our base without further incident, but the experience left all 4 of us badly shaken. During debriefing, we told intelligence officers about the encounter with the German formation, but we left out the more unusual details. Who would have believed us? The official report listed the encounter as encounter with enemy aircraft of unknown designation and was promptly classified. But that wasn't the end of the story. 3 days later, I was called to meet with a man from OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. He introduced himself only as Mr. Smith and said he wanted to hear about our encounter in detail. I told him everything, including the strange behavior of the German planes and the abandoned airfield. He listened without interruption, taking notes in a small leather journal. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Colonel Matthews, what you encountered was Jagdgeschwader 77, a German fighter squadron that was shot down over that same airfield in 1943. Every man in that unit died, along with several Allied pilots who were trying to bomb the facility." "That's impossible," I replied. "We saw them flying. We engaged them in combat." Mr. Smith leaned forward. "Colonel Matthews, this war has created more ghosts than any conflict in human history. Millions of men have died violent deaths far from home, and some of them haven't accepted that they're dead. They keep fighting the same battles over and over, trapped in the moments of their destruction." He went on to explain that similar encounters had been reported throughout the European theater. Phantom aircraft appearing on radar, engaging in combat, then vanishing without a trace. Bomber crews reporting attacks by planes that military intelligence knew had been destroyed months earlier. "The airfield you saw," he continued, "was bombed by the RAF in October 1943. Everyone stationed there was killed, including a group of Allied prisoners who were being held in the hangars. The official records show it was abandoned after the attack, but pilots keep reporting activity there." I asked him what we were supposed to do with this information. "Nothing," he said. "You write your report,